Order, please. We'll start today's proceedings. And before we go to the daily routine, I have a speaker's ruling that I'd like to indulge your attention with for a moment. On Monday, I delivered a ruling explaining that it is not in order to ask a minister a question or to raise and debate matters falling under the administration of the Speaker. And this was with respect to a question that the member for Dartmouth East had started the raising question period on Thursday, November the 4th. After I ruled, the member for Cape Breton South asked me to address a point he'd raised that the member for Dartmouth East had been delivering a preamble to his intended question, and that I had stopped him before he'd posed the full body of his question. The member for Cape Breton South questioned how I could do this without having heard the entire question that followed the preamble. Now, I understand, the member's frustration with the way the ruling unfolded, and I think it's worth explaining my reasoning for stopping the question. As members will know, the chair prepares for a variety of possible situations that may occur during any sitting, and prepares for procedural questions that may come up as a result. I had received a number of media inquiries about a personnel matter falling under the Speaker's administration, and I expected that matters being pursued by the press might also be pursued here in the House. However, I'm also aware that questions about matters falling under my administration are not to be posed to ministers in the House during question period. Now, as I explained in my ruling on Monday, that is one of the long-established practices governing the business here in our House. When I heard the preamble to the question, raising just such a matter, I intervened to uphold that principle. Now, perhaps I was like an expectant father and I jumped into action more quickly than usual, but I felt it was appropriate to stop the question before it went too far. A preamble to a question, to the extent a preamble is permitted, is required to be directly relevant to the question that's being asked. Accordingly, when I heard the subject of the question, I felt it appropriate to take action because I had heard a subject that is out of order. Now, I understand that many members may not have previously been familiar with the parliamentary practice I was seeking to enforce, and that quick intervention on my part may have surprised some members. And I trust that members will now know that there was a parliamentary practice an issue, and I certainly was not attempting to impose an arbitrary measure. Because of this, in the future, I will be mindful when dealing with some of the less-known principles that bind parliamentary practice to offer a more immediate explanation of the reasoning I am applying. And I recognize that members would have been less surprised by my intervention on Thursday if I allowed the entire question before ruling it out of order. And I hope they'll understand that my intent was to uphold basic parliamentary principles, not to stifle debate, even though that is how it may have been felt in the spur of the moment. It is truly my intent to allow members as much latitude as possible in exercising their freedom of speech in this place within the bounds set by traditional parliamentary practice. And I thank all honourable members for their attention today and their ongoing cooperation in the days to come. Thank you. With that, we'll go on. Before the daily routine, the Honourable Minister of Health on an introduction.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to draw attention to the East Gallery, where we're joined today by Mr. Bill Van Goyer, who is with CARP, the Canadian Association of Retired Persons, and I'd ask Mr. Van Goyer to stand and receive the warm welcome of the House.
We welcome all our visitors here this afternoon and hope you enjoy the proceedings here in our legislature. Moving on to the daily routine, presenting and reading petitions. Presenting reports of committees. Tabling reports, regulations, and other papers. The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Can I also be permitted an introduction as I table this report?
Certainly.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, also in our East Gallery today, we are joined by some members from the Nova Scotia Health Research Foundation. They are Dr. Jean Gray, Board Chair, Krista Connell, the CEO, Ryan McCarthy, Director of Programs, and Nancy Carter, Director of Evaluation Services. And I'd ask members to give them a warm welcome. And Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to table the annual report of the Nova Scotia Health Research Foundation, their annual report.
The report is tabled. The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to table the annual report of the Maritime Provinces Higher Education Commission for 2009-2010. Thank you.
The report is tabled. Any further reports, regulations, or other papers? Statements by ministers. Government notices of motion. The Honourable Deputy Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on the future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas hundreds of thousands of Nova Scotians, men and women, bravely fought overseas and came home wounded or didn't come home at all in order to protect the freedoms and rights that we enjoy today as Canadian citizens. And whereas members of the Canadian Armed Forces continue to serve around the world promoting peace and helping strengthen communities in war-torn, impoverished countries. And whereas every November 11th, Canadians celebrate Remembrance Day by wearing a poppy and attending memorial services in recognition of sacrifices that our veterans made and those that our members of Canadian Armed Forces continue to make. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of the legislature recognize the supreme sacrifice of these men and women made for their country and take part in the moment of silence in honor of Remembrance Day, those fallen heroes, and of all our veterans. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour signify by saying aye. Aye. Those against say nay. The motion is carried. Introduction of bills. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, moment of silence. Okay. Thank you. Introduction of bills. The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to table a bill entitled An Act Respecting the Office of the Auditor General.
The Honourable Minister of Finance begs leave to introduce a bill, an act respecting the office of the Auditor General.
Bill number 90, an act respecting the office of the Auditor General.
Order this bill be read a second time on a future day. The Honourable Member for Sackville-Cobequid.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On behalf of my colleague from Halifax Atlantic, I beg leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amalgamate the Royal Nova Scotia Yacht Squadron and the Saragway Club.
The Honourable Member for Sackville-Cobequid, on behalf of the Member for Halifax Atlantic, begs leave to introduce a bill, an act to amalgamate the Royal Nova Scotia Yacht Squadron and the Saragway Club.
Bill number 91, an act to amalgamate the Royal Nova Scotia Yacht Squadron and the Saragway Club.
Order this bill be read a second time on a future day. The honourable member for Kings West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to table a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 6 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Agriculture and Marketing Act.
The honourable member for Kings West begs leave to introduce a bill, an act to amend Chapter 6 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Agriculture and Marketing Act.
Bill number 92, an act to amend Chapter 6 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Agriculture and Marketing Act.
Order this bill be read a second time on a future day. Notices of motion. The Honourable Opposition House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day as to move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas every year on November the 11th, we pause to honor the men and women who have served and continue to serve our country during times of war, conflict, and peace. And whereas active service in wars and conflict touched and continues to touch the lives of Canadians of all ages, races, and social classes, as fathers, sons, and daughters have died in the pursuit of freedom and peace, with the remainder forced to live their lives with the mental scars of war. And whereas during times when we take for granted our Canadian values and institutions, we must pause to remember those who serve our country in different lands as they did and continue to do so, believing that their actions in the present made and will make a significant difference in the future. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of the House pause and pay tribute to those brave men and women who have served and continue to serve our country, and acknowledge our responsibility to work for the peace they fought and continue to fight to achieve. Mr. Speaker, I'm presenting this on behalf of the Honourable Stephen McNeil, Leader of our party today, and I would ask for a waiver of notice.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour signify by saying aye. Aye. Those against say nay. The motion is carried. The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future date I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas tomorrow at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, Canadians from coast to coast will pause to remember and commemorate the sacrifices of members of our armed forces, those who never returned to our shores and those who are away from us now, among others, serving our country and defending the rule of law. And whereas it be on the battlefields of Europe, the hills of Korea, or in the desert sands of Afghanistan, or in other places of conflict and war around the world, Canadian servicemen and women have willingly undertaken unbelievable hardship to fight against injustice and terror and to promote freedom and democracy. And whereas Canada is a beacon of freedom to people all around the world, and we have the brave men and women of our armed forces to thank for forging that proud reputation, therefore be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly take time to teach future generations about Canada's heroes, to instill in our children and grandchildren a true appreciation of the traditions of peace and freedom we enjoy in our great country, and most importantly, to ensure the courage and sacrifice of Canadian servicemen and women is never forgotten. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. Agreed. All those in favour signify by saying aye. Aye. Those against say nay. The motion is carried. The honourable member for Richmond.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Remembrance Day will be celebrated throughout our country on November the 11th, whereas members of Royal Canadian Legion Branch 47 in St. Peter's will hold a number of events in memory of those who made the supreme sacrifice. Whereas after a ceremony at St. Peter's Lions Hall, a wreath-laying ceremony will take place at St. Peter's Cenotaph, followed by wreath-laying ceremonies at other local cenotaphs, and ending with a Remembrance Day supper at Branch 47. Therefore, be it resolved, members of the House of Assembly congratulate Branch 47 President Jack Hopkins, the executive, veterans, and the entire membership for their continued efforts to celebrate Remembrance Day so that we may never forget the sacrifices made by so many to ensure our freedom. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice, passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour signify by saying aye. Aye. Those against say nay. The motion is carried. No further notices of motion. We're going into question period again. Just a reminder, no electronic equipment on for other questioners or answers. And I just ask that you direct your questions here through myself as Speaker. Time now is 12:24, and oral question period will continue until 1:24. The honourable member for Richmond.
Mr. Speaker, on Friday, the Justice Department allowed Vernon Martel to walk free after a court order to incarcerate him. This was not noticed by the Justice Department until Monday afternoon. Speaker, the department is quoted in today's Chronicle Herald as saying, quote, "something wasn't done," end quote. Speaker, this is the only explanation that the Justice Department could come up with. And today, the Justice Minister merely says it was a clerical error. Mr. Speaker, Vernon Martel was released by this Justice Department on Friday. Then on Monday, the department and the police apparently phoned up Mr. Martel to ask him to come back to the Burnside facility. Mr. Speaker, my question to the Minister of Justice, how can he justify these continued errors which are leading to the mistaken release of prisoners in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm very happy to say that Mr. Martel is presently in Burnside, where he's going to be residing for the next number of weeks. There was an error made last, or at least till his time is up. There was an error made last Friday that was picked up by the corrections facility on Monday afternoon, and at that time, late Monday afternoon, at that time, the police were notified, and police were in contact with Mr. Martel, and he's presently incarcerated now.
The honourable member for Richmond on your first supplementary.
You know, Mr. Speaker, you could almost go back through Hansard and Ledge TV from a year ago, 2 years ago, and just replay the same questions, just different Minister of Justice, but the same issue. Mr. Speaker, we've been here before. They've pointed out these errors, they've taken place before, and yet we were told this would not happen again. Yet we have a Minister of Justice here who will not tell us exactly what went wrong that allowed this type of problem to happen. Nova Scotians are looking for confidence in their system. The Minister of Justice has said to correct the problems of overcrowding at Burnside, he's going to put 100 new beds. Well, they're not 100 new beds. He's taking the temporary beds and he's bolting them to a wall. At the same time, he has sent his Director of Corrections at the Burnside facility to make sure these problems did not occur again. My question to the Minister of Justice is, when will he be able to stand up in this House and say that his department and this government finally have control over justice matters in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
I'm very glad to answer that question. We have control. The fact is that there will be gaps, there will be errors made over time, and they won't stop because this one happened this time. We have looked at the issue, we have addressed it with the employee, we've taken appropriate action, and I'm very confident that this issue has been addressed. But to bring up the past and say that the previous government had ample errors, there are errors that will occur in the system. The real issue is here, are we doing something about it? We have addressed it. The individual is incarcerated. But this member, Mr. Speaker, he takes a negative view on everything, and hopefully sometime he'll have something positive to say within himself.
The honourable member for Richmond on your final supplementary.
Well, you know, Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians who are sitting at home and hearing today reading of the type of convictions that Mr. Martel has, and knowing that his department allowed a clerical error to have him roam free, I don't think too many Nova Scotians would have anything positive to say to this Minister of Justice, nor would they expect me to say anything positive in light of this matter. Mr. Speaker, one of these times, someone's going to get hurt. An innocent Nova Scotian is going to get hurt because of these errors. They cannot continue. We were told they would not continue, and yet the minister tells us expect it to happen again in the future. Mr. Speaker, we had been told that steps had been taken to ensure this would not happen again, that the problems at Burnside were under control. My question again to the minister, when can Nova Scotians finally have confidence, our police, our prosecutors, and our judges, that this government actually has the Department of Justice under control?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
They can have confidence. I have confidence, and I believe in the system. Will there be errors made from time to time? That will occur. This incident did not occur at Burnside. It happened within the court system, and that's where the error happened. We are aware of where it happened. We have addressed the issue, and I'm very confident that this issue with the employees that are involved here won't be repeated. But I'm not confident that dealing with the human element of society, that mistakes won't happen in the future. But each and every time, we'll address it in a very timely, professional manner. And that's what we've done, and that's what we'll continue to do.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My first question through you is to the Minister of Justice. Why did the minister decide to wait until 4 minutes after the legislature rose yesterday to announce the mistaken release of Mr. Martel? Was it the minister's feeble attempt to avoid facing the music in this place and to ensure the latest foul-up by this minister was not on the evening newscast? Why didn't the minister announce his mistake as soon as he found out?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you for the question there from the honourable member. Mr. Speaker, you have to look at the timeline. We became aware of this issue late Monday evening, and I asked to get the complete facts and details. And I think as I look at the timeline, I remember finishing in the question period here yesterday, which of course is an hour and a half, that the message had come in for me to review the press release sometime before that. But of course in here you can't turn the electronics on, and I didn't respond. So that's one part of that answer. Had I looked at it sooner, I would have been able to do that. But as the honourable member can recall, being in this position, there's a number of things that come and you have to address them in a sequence. And when I first got that message, I authorized the press release, and I'm very satisfied with that release.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton North on your first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, in January 2008, the topic of mistakenly released prisoners was in the news, and don't I know it. At the time, one gentleman proclaimed loudly that, quote, one gentleman proclaimed loudly, and I quote, somebody sat on that information hoping the person in question could be recaptured without it becoming a news item. That's not the way to do business, unquote. Mr. Speaker, that gentleman was the member for Timberley Prospect, the Minister of Transportation. Oh, how times change when a socialist regime is in charge, Mr. Speaker. In January 2008, a policy was put in place in the Department of Justice that ensured Nova Scotians would be alerted immediately if another inmate is mistakenly released. The policy said that any breach would be disclosed and that it would be communicated as soon as it was received. Mr. Speaker, my question to the minister, has this government changed the policy, and if they have, why? Or did this minister purposely delay letting Nova Scotians know when they should have known?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, I take this matter very seriously, and I believe in getting information, and I believe that one doesn't just arbitrarily react on emotion or to try to do things because we can grandstand before the camera or before the press, like some members of this House. And I believe in transparency within the system, and I am very committed to ensuring that the clear messages go out to all Nova Scotians and that appropriate action is taken.
The Honourable Member of Cape Breton North and your final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Justice may want to talk to the Honourable Member from Timberley Prospect, because he be one of the people to say the strong leaders don't blame staff, competent leaders take responsibility like a man, and we're waiting for that minister to stand up and do the right thing in this chamber. Being minister means the buck stops with him. It means taking responsibility for everything that happens in your department, good and bad. Will this minister announce today that he has evaded his responsibility in this incident and apologize to the people of Nova Scotia for once again putting his political interests ahead of the public interest, Mr. Speaker?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, I can hear the tone and the emotion in the individual member for the past issues that brought some discomfort to him, but I want to assure all Nova Scotians that I am on top of this issue. I am concerned with these types of errors, but gaps will happen within the system, but we will not take them lightly. We will deal with them in a very firm, positive manner, and I take responsibility for the department and what happens there. Thank you.
The honourable member for Richmond.
Mr. Speaker, how ironic in this House, the Minister of Justice said, I firmly believe you do to crime, you do to time. Well, how hollow those words ring today. Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Justice has acknowledged that his department learned of their mistake last Friday on Monday afternoon. Nova Scotians are left wondering, after reading today of Mr. Martel's criminal history, why would they not have immediately been informed of the fact that he was supposed to be incarcerated and was in fact on the loose. Instead, the Minister of Justice now tells us he was too busy in question period to approve a press release informing Nova Scotians that this dangerous individual was on the loose and not incarcerated. So let me ask the Minister of Justice, why did you not put out your press release informing Nova Scotians of this error as soon as you became aware of it?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
I want to just thank the member from the opposition there for stressing my point. I do believe firmly that if you do the crime, you do the time. And there's no question about that. And this individual is incarcerated and will be doing the time. The individual was on a conditional discharge and he breached that. As a matter of the breach, he was called back into the court, and that's where the error occurred. And on the issue that he raises about receiving messages and sending out information, I believe that you have to send out accurate information and not just a response to say that you're responding to something. Get the facts straight, communicate clearly with all Nova Scotians, and ensure that they have all the information. That's what we did. And it's in our process of timing, the fact that I am in the House and wasn't going to check my emails till afterwards, that's the way it is, and that's the system. And I didn't send it out before then because we didn't have all the information at that point.
The honourable member for Richmond on your first supplementary.
You know, Mr. Speaker, as was suggested by the previous questioner, I really think the Minister should speak to the Minister of Energy when he speaks about the competency in his department and the confidence he has in his staff. Because for the Minister of Justice to stand here and tell us that they learned on Monday afternoon that a dangerous individual had been mistakenly released and that it took over 24 hours before he could get the information, the accurate information required, what an insult to the men and women who work in the Department of Justice to make such a suggestion. And then to send out the press release right after question period, right after the evening news were done, the Minister of Justice faced a scrum outside and no one believed him, and I don't think any Nova Scotians will believe him. The questions Nova Scotians have, not only why did it take so long, but had Mr. Martel actually returned to the correctional facility on Monday night, would Nova Scotians have ever learned of the error that took place?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
The answer to that question is yes, and I just want to clarify one point. Quite often, I find with the opposition, they use terms such as dangerous individual. I'd like to know what he's basing that on and to make that reference.
The honourable member for Richmond on your final supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I believe it's over 20 offences, break-in enters into people's property, a repeat criminal offender, and this minister doesn't consider him dangerous. Is that what the new standard is under the NDP government, that you can commit crime as long as you're just a repeat crime offender and no one is physically hurt, even though your property's been stolen, you're a victim of crime? It's not dangerous in the eyes of this minister. Mr. Speaker, we've reached a new level here under this NDP government. Mr. Speaker, no Nova Scotian would want Mr. Martel sitting in that kitchen table. Let's get that straight, whether this minister considers him under the term dangerous or not. Yet this minister sat on this information for nothing more than purely political reasons. The press know it and Nova Scotians know it. Will the minister finally admit that the reason why it took so long was that he was trying to control the political fallout of yet another release under his watch?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You can twist things. The dangerous offender, this individual was out on a conditional discharge by the court. Mr. Speaker, this individual is on a conditional discharge and was in breach of that. That's the facts.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, onshore drilling is becoming more economically attractive in various sites across Nova Scotia, and particularly areas like Lake Ainslie and Hants County. And many of these projects have been proposed involving fracking as a possibility, which, as the minister would know, involves pumping water and proprietary chemicals deep into the ground to blast apart the rock. Now, many residents are understandably concerned. They've not been given information by the Department of Energy about how the department will protect Nova Scotians, and several U.S. sites have seen large reserves of groundwater impacted by fracking operations. And while the most advanced project is obviously up in Lake Ainslie, and it's not a certainty, Petroworth has confirmed that fracking may be used as part of the development process there. Mr. Speaker, does the Minister of Energy intend to allow fracking as part of the onshore gas development in Lake Ainslie, and will he personally go to meet with residents there to hear their concerns?
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member opposite for the question. Through the good graces of the MLA from Inverness, yesterday afternoon I had the opportunity to meet with residents, one particular resident, Tom Ooman, who was very helpful, along with the important copy of the Inverness Oran. If you want to know what's happening in that particular part of Nova Scotia, you read that valuable community paper. And with Tom at that time was Angela Giles from the Coalition of Canadians. It was an opportunity for us, along with staff, Sandy McMullen in particular was present, at which time we had a very positive exchange in terms of particularly communicating with the residents locally, making sure they are aware of the issues. There was a community meeting that was held in the Inverness area, very well attended. Sandy McMullen was there from my staff. It's that open lines of communication that we're going to continue, whether it's with the Coalition of Canadians or with individual residents such as Tom Ooman from Inverness. And I want to thank the MLA for Inverness for setting up that meeting. It was very informative, I assure you.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East on your first supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm aware that the minister met with a couple of people yesterday, but I've been to Lake Ainslie a number of times, and they're still wondering when the minister, not his staff, are going to actually come up and meet with them. And I've heard again from them this morning, wondering when the minister is going to go to Lake Ainslie personally and meet with a variety of residents up there, just not one or two. And Mr. Speaker, the minister didn't answer whether he would be willing to approve fracking. Mr. Speaker, there's many geologists and residents in Cape Breton and elsewhere who may be comfortable with fracking, in fact, yet they don't have the information, and many geologists in Nova Scotia have suggested one of the problems is the regulations that the Department of Energy has, which don't require full containment of wells. And if the wells aren't properly constructed, you can have major issues. Mr. Speaker, when fracking has caused environmental damage in other areas, it has almost always been as a result of one of two things, either surface spills or seepage up the sides of improperly regulated and constructed wells. So, Mr. Minister, will you commit to Nova Scotians that if the government decides to endorse fracking, you will require that wells are constructed to the highest possible standards and standards which will be constructed to prevent seepage?
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member opposite. Based upon my reading habits, many people in this legislature would be assured of the fact that I don't often read the New York Times. But I can assure you that this number of interesting articles have been brought to my attention from the New York Times, particularly when it deals with Pennsylvania and upstate New York. Concerns about wells and water, of course, remain at the top of those particular concerns. In addition, Mr. Speaker, I've had the opportunity to speak to New Brunswickers, part of the native province, of course, of which I was originally from, particularly in the Sussex area. And I'm concerned, of course, with the issue that's been brought up, particularly in that part of the region, when we look at the concerns for waters and wells. And then in addition to that, of course, there's the Quebec situation. So when it comes to fracking, I want the member opposite to know, and I want Nova Scotians to know, that the Department of Energy and the department that I'm responsible for are certainly aware of some of the concerns about fracking. We're going to very carefully monitor the situation. We're learning from other jurisdictions, and I want the people from West Lake Ainslie to know that they, of course, live, work, bring their kids up in a beautiful community that has to remain safe, with safe drinking water, and that will continue to remain a priority for this government and this energy minister.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East on your final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the minister has certainly brought the idea that this is not answer period to new heights today. He hasn't answered whether he will go personally to Lake Ainslie to meet with the residents. He hasn't answered whether he will actually approve fracking or whether he will consider approve fracking, and he hasn't answered whether he will update the regulations to ensure that the wells are required to be built correctly. So, Mr. Speaker, given that, is the Minister of Energy prepared to take personal responsibility for any decision by the government to allow fracking?
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Thank you. Thank you to the member opposite. A number of questions, and I'm not going to attempt to answer them all. The concern I want that member to know, and I think that members of this House know, and members on this side of the House certainly know, as a minister in this cabinet and as minister of the Crown, I do take things personally. I will be the place, I will be the decider on the issue. It'll arrive eventually on my desk. When that time comes, I'll personally stand by the decision.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question this morning is to the Premier. Yesterday, in question period, the government made a great show of patting themselves on the back for their alleged newfound financial management skills. But while they claim that they are serious about getting Nova Scotia's finances back in order, a look at the government's own estimates indicates a far different story, Mr. Speaker. They talk about spending restraint, but the fact is that the overall level of government expenditures are up over 6% since they came to power, far exceeding the rate of inflation and population growth. My question to the Premier: if your government is so committed to reining in spending as you claim, why do you continue to increase the level of overall spending at this rate?
The Honourable Deputy Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, Mr. Speaker, it's a great question, but a lot of this is we're still cleaning up after those proverbial elephants, Mr. Speaker, that we had to pay off, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, we've done just recently. I've sent letters to all departments not to go on a spending spree, Mr. Speaker. We've done that, Mr. Speaker, and I'll quote a great Nova Scotia when he says, "We're going to make sure a penny saved is a penny saved."
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on your first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll assume those elephants are white elephants, knowing the history of this government to date. My second question to the Premier is this. In addition to the spending issue, the government has also said they want to reduce the size of the civil service. However, it's recently been reported that the 9.6% of government jobs that were left unfilled by the previous government have now, in fact, been filled by the NDP, losing an opportunity for actual, real constraint by the government. So my second question to the Premier: why does your government continue to pretend to act responsibly when the facts show the opposite?
The Honourable Deputy Premier.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I realize that the member was otherwise entertained in another job while that spending was going on by the other crowd. But in reality, Mr. Speaker, that number, the numbers that he talked about were numbers that this government, that former government, had taken in and take them into the legislature or into the greater civil service, Mr. Speaker. We are the ones working at downsizing the size of the civil service, and it will be down by 1,000, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on your final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I may be new, but I am still getting used to the idea that down is up and more is less, because that's what I hear from this government when they answer these questions. And that is why Nova Scotians are so cynical about what they hear from the government today, Mr. Speaker. So my final question, at a time when public confidence in our political system is so low, why does the government continue to play these shell games with its own numbers when Nova Scotians deserve straight answers? It is another example of why we are going in the wrong direction.
The Honourable Deputy Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I'll assure the Leader of the Third Party and all Nova Scotians that if there's anybody playing a shell game with numbers, it's those folks. Mr. Speaker, we're being forthright with Nova Scotians. We inherited a structural deficit. We're going to fix it, and Nova Scotia will be a better place for it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Digby Annapolis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Tourism. Mr. Speaker, the Digby Pines has been a beautiful resort for travellers for more than 80 years in western Nova Scotia. Now, along with Celtic Lodge, Liscombe Lodge, their futures are in jeopardy, and employees and tourism operators alike are concerned after reports they've been hearing that it may be sold. So my question to the Minister, what is your department doing to ensure the Digby Pines, the Liscombe Lodge and Celtic Lodge stay open and operational?
The Honourable Minister of Tourism, Culture and Heritage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I can say for the signature resorts that are in the possession of the province of Nova Scotia is that when we came into government, we recognize and we do appreciate that there's been some years of neglect there. These resorts, admittedly so, Mr. Speaker, and I don't think this is any great secret, they are in need of great repairs. And actually right now, Mr. Speaker, if the member opposite would like to meet me at any point in time, I would certainly go into greater detail. We are exploring some options with respect to the resorts, and I'll say in this House, Mr. Speaker, that certainly one of the options that we are calling for exploration on, and I think if we didn't, it would be ill-fated in us. So we are exploring a number of options. One of which is what's the value of those resorts on the open market, Mr. Speaker? In order for us to make wise decisions, I think it's prudent on us, Mr. Speaker, to explore all the options before we make a decision.
The honourable member for Digby Annapolis on your first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Economic Development. Mr. Speaker, Western Nova Scotia has already been hit hard because of the NDP government's rash decision to cut the funding to the Cat Ferry. If the area loses the Digby Pines, there's no telling what economic downfall will hit that region. We're losing jobs, Mr. Speaker. We're losing economic development, and we're losing Nova Scotians to other provinces. So my question to the Minister, what is your department's plan for economic development if the Digby Pines is closed?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, you know, we never answer questions on what if, but I can tell you this, Mr. Speaker. Is that certainly this government has been working with Team Southwest, working with a strategy about what the future looks like. And Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to say that one of the things that we've learned in the last number of months, if not the last number of years, from working with Team West, is that we want to portray the area as a positive, not as a negative. We want to portray the Southwest region. We want to portray the Southwest region as a place of a destination, which is something new and unique from previous governments, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Digby Annapolis on your final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, I'll go back to the Minister of Tourism. Mr. Speaker, these three important tourist destinations all have reported losses for the first time in this past year alone since this government took power. The NDP government's decision to have weakened tourism and economic development, their decision has weakened tourism and economic development in Nova Scotia. These three resorts are icons in tourism, and all three could be lost if government does not act immediately to secure their future. So my question to the Minister, will you commit to keeping these three crucial tourism destinations open in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Tourism, Culture and Heritage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, what we will commit to is making the best decisions for the citizens of this province. That decision will not be made until we have all the information, all the appropriate information in front of us. Mr. Speaker, we are doing due diligence. We are not going to act in haste. We are going to make decisions based on good business strategies and census.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Premier. Recently, the Fraser Institute released a report on labour market productivity in Nova Scotia. I know the Fraser Institute is a favourite of this government, Mr. Speaker. That's why I chose them in particular for this question. But Nova Scotia did not fare well at all in their report. Government may continue to be growing in our province, Mr. Speaker, but the report points out that private sector growth in Nova Scotia has become stagnant. Another example of Nova Scotia being taken in the wrong direction. My question to the Premier: how do you expect Nova Scotia businesses to expand and employ people when you continue to make it harder for them to succeed by raising our tax burden to the highest in the country?
The Honourable Deputy Premier.
Well, the member opposite is quite correct. The Fraser Institute isn't one of my favourite institutes of learning. But, Mr. Speaker, and he's right on this, that we have some productivity issues here. And it was a mess we inherited, and it's something we're going to correct, and we're going to turn it around, and we will go from stagnation to growth, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on your first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, we're seeing an example of real leadership in action with these answers so far today, Mr. Speaker. In that same report, Nova Scotia ranked 56 out of 60 provinces and states in North America for our unemployment rate, which now is even higher today at 8.9%. My question to the Premier: when will the unemployment rate in Nova Scotia actually drop, when businesses from here and abroad do not have any confidence that your government will ever lighten the burden that has been placed upon them in taxes and regulation?
The Honourable Deputy Premier.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we have done lighten the burden in many ways, Mr. Speaker, and the reality is we've companies like Daewoo that are investing in Nova Scotia. It's companies like that that's going to bring our employment levels down, or unemployment levels down, Mr. Speaker, and this province will grow, as I said earlier, and these are the issues that we inherited, that we have to turn this around, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
The Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on your final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. These statistics don't just indicate that there is a problem for existing small business in Nova Scotia, but in fact they serve as a deterrent to future investment and development in our business sector, further endangering our future prosperity. So my final question to the Premier: when will your government finally take the needs of small business seriously and start implementing policies that actually cause growth and success?
The Honourable Deputy Premier.
Mr. Speaker, that's probably an area, again, we agree on. It's the importance of small business in this province. We've helped them around taxation purposes, Mr. Speaker, and we will continue to work with that sector and grow it to make Nova Scotia strong from Cape North to Yarmouth. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Richmond.
Mr. Speaker, on October 20th, 2010, the chair of the Public Accounts Committee, the Honourable Member for Halifax Clayton Park, wrote to the Deputy Minister of Justice. In her letter, it states, and I quote, "It has recently come to the attention of the Standing Committee on Public Accounts that thousands of prisoners sentenced to jail time were being sent home from the Burnside Correctional Facility, and that some of these criminals have been sexual offenders. As this issue is now before the Public Accounts Committee, the committee is requesting a response to the following. Number one, which offenders benefited from these temporary absences? Number two, of what types of crimes were they found guilty? Number three, did they reoffend while out of custody? Please forward your response within the next 2 to 3 weeks. Mr. Speaker, today is the 3-week mark. I'm wondering if the Minister of Justice could tell us why was that information not provided to the Public Accounts Committee this morning?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I spoke with the members that raised the question with colleague just a little while ago and said that that matter be addressed and information will be passed on to them.
The Honourable Member for Richmond on your first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, there seems to be a different standard in how quick communication takes place in the Department of Justice, because although they became aware on Monday that they'd mistakenly let an offender out, they only put out a press release on Tuesday evening. Although we raised the issue of temporary absences quite a few weeks ago, they're still working on trying to get that information out, yet when Mr. Vernon Martel turned himself into the Burnside facility this morning, a press release has already gone out indicating that that has taken place. So it's very clear that there seems to be different priorities within the Department of Justice as to how quick they get information out. So my question again, when the Liberal caucus tried to file a Freedom of Information request regarding temporary absences, we received a reply with a bill for $2,000 in order to get that information. I'm wondering, will the Minister of Justice explain why he has not given this issue a bigger priority in his department?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
The information thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member. The information that's being sought there deals with over a 20-year period. And so I'm not surprised that it takes some time to gather that data, and but we will follow up and see where the status is.
The Honourable Member for Richmond on your final supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, with all due respect, it's my understanding that when asked earlier today, the Minister of Justice didn't know about the requests that had been made by the Public Accounts Committee. So again, I'm left to wonder exactly what control or influence he is exerting over the Department of Justice. Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Justice was here in the House when he heard the Premier earlier this week talking about the transparency of this government. And yet more and more we're seeing how they are acting like the previous administration in trying to get information to Nova Scotians. Nova Scotians were very concerned knowing that people were being given temporary absences, up to 15 every weekend. Will the Minister of Justice again tell us, is this delay because that they really have something to hide here?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member for the question. As a government, we said we're going to release the information. I don't know a lot about the history of this House. I do know some, but one of the things I am aware of, it's not quite frequent that that type of data has been provided before, but we're definitely going to do it, and I thank the member for his request.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, another favourite of the current government I know, is the voice of small business in our province. And they don't feel like the government is working with them, Mr. Speaker, because they recently released their quarterly small business survey, which gauges the sentiment of small business owners across the province. The top concern of small business, identified by 65% of respondents, is tax and regulatory costs in Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker, another example of this government taking our province in the wrong direction. So my question to the Premier, how can the government claim that tax like the HST and other regulatory costs are not a concern of the business community when the vast majority of them identified as their #1 concern?
The Honourable Deputy Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, Mr. Speaker, in reply through you to the Leader of the Third Party, I want to say that that group also said that business confidence is up in this province, Mr. Speaker, and we're creating good jobs, Mr. Speaker. Since June 09, Mr. Speaker, we've either retained or got 7,500 new jobs in this province, and we're moving forward with that, Mr. Speaker, and we will build on that. Thank you.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on your first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Only an NDP government would claim to have created or maintained jobs, Mr. Speaker, because we all know it is the small businesses of the province that actually create and maintain those jobs, and they are doing that despite the performance of this government, not because of it. And so, Mr. Speaker, in a province where the taxes are the highest in the country and our debt continues to grow, where uncertainty reigns, which makes business investment more difficult. This is what the CFIB members are telling us. So my question to the Premier, why does your government continue to add to this uncertainty in the business community by refusing to address their concerns, the concerns of Nova Scotia's small businesses?
And why?
The Honourable Deputy Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the only person that seems to think that we're not doing anything is the Leader of the Third Party. Mr. Speaker, we in issues like broadband, community development trust, Mr. Speaker, NS right, protection and the productivity and innovative vouchers, Mr. Speaker. We've done many things in these areas, and that's why we want to move forward. These folks want to drive us back to the past that led us to the problems we face today, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party, in your final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, if the member opposite thinks that I am the only one that feels this way, then he and his government are clearly not listening, Mr. Speaker. So my final question, why does your government refuse to listen to the voices of small business in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Deputy Premier.
Well, you know, Mr. Speaker, we could probably do like the last time they had a majority in the House and that charade of the red tape task force. We all remember how well that was listened to, Mr. Speaker. We listened. We've met recently with the small business representatives, and we're listening, and we're not only listening, Mr. Speaker, we're taking actions of what they're doing. We're going to do something. We're not going to do a task force and let it gather dust on some desk, Mr. Speaker. We're going to work on behalf of all Nova Scotians to build this economy. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Bedford Birch Cove.
Mr. Speaker, the O'Neill report made the following recommendation, number 5G. Explore the potential for merger or significant affiliation of Mount St. Vincent University with either Dalhousie or St. Mary's to mitigate declining enrollment risks at MSVU. Dr. O'Neill talked about merger without acknowledging the partnerships MSVU already has in place. They have worked with NSCC, the New Brunswick Community College, and they have a joint master's program with St. Mary's, in addition to forging several partnerships abroad. They are making every effort to better serve their students, and there was no acknowledgement of this work in the O'Neill report. My question for the Minister of Education, will you acknowledge MSVU's current efforts to partner and dismiss the idea of a merger with other Halifax post-secondary institutions?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've had the opportunity to meet with the interim president of Mount St. Vincent a couple of times since the release of the O'Neill report, and also the chair of the Board of Governors. And they have carefully explained some of the partnerships that the honourable member has described. And as I explained to them, the government sees the O'Neill report as part of their information gathering stage before they develop a process to have further consultations and discussions with the major stakeholders in post-secondary education. And certainly, I think what the honourable member has left out of her initial question is the fact that Dr. O'Neill, I think much to the relief of many people, did say that major structural change at this point would not create cost savings, and suggested that any mergers or affiliations or amalgamations or partnerships should be done at the initiative of the universities themselves. So this is not a case where government's going to be demanding anything in terms of those partnerships and mergers. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Bedford Birch Cove, on your first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the Minister well knows, the O'Neill report did not get rid of the specter of merger. It simply said, oh, well, let's delay that for 5 years. We're not going to talk about it for 5 years. But it's hanging over their heads at the smaller universities. And, Mr. Speaker, to say that this report, this deeply flawed report, is part of the information gathering stage begs the question, why would you use it as information gathering if in fact its information is wrong or incomplete? Mr. Speaker, it appears that Dr. O'Neill had his sights set on Mount St. Vincent from the beginning. He seems to have concluded the institution will have declining enrollment and won't be able to balance its books. Well, in fact, that institution has had 15 consecutive balanced budgets. So my question to the Minister, why are we penalizing an institution that has lived within its means, and isn't that what your government is claiming it's trying to do?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
One of the first steps, thank you, Mr. Speaker, one of the first steps that this government took after the O'Neill report was presented to the government was to meet with the major stakeholders, the student organizations, the presidents of the universities, and some of the Board of Governor chairs through CONSUP, and also with faculty groups and other interested groups in the province. And they had an opportunity to talk and to bring out some of the general themes, to do further analysis. They were offered an opportunity to correct the record if they felt that there was information in there that wasn't fair or doesn't describe their particular situation in a way that would be helpful to government. We are collecting further information, and you can be sure that any decisions made regarding post-secondary education in this province will be done in a very thoughtful, reasonable manner that will represent the interests of Nova Scotians. Thank you.
The honourable member for Bedford Birch Cove on your final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, wouldn't it have been better if Dr. O'Neill had actually met with these groups more than once and actually got the full story from them instead of putting in half-truths and misinformation in his report? We paid $90,000 for this report, and it's not accurate. In fact, it's clear Dr. O'Neill missed some key pieces of information when he examined Mount St. Vincent. But the Mount isn't the only one he erred on. He also suggested that NASCAD wasn't doing research, and I'm going to table a document now showing the research grants they've secured. My question to the minister, will you take note of these inaccuracies and go on record as supporting these institutions as fully independent?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just have to repeat that we are providing plenty of opportunity for the degree-granting institutions in this province to provide additional information, to take part in consultations and discussions. They are fully independent organizations, and certainly their boards of governors will make decisions regarding what's in the best interests of their institutions, their history, their future, and their students. Thank you.
The honourable member for Preston.
Mr. Speaker, the people of Monarch, Riverdale Estates and Beaverbank have been bounced around for too long by this government and by their elected representative. It is clear from her responses to questions 2 weeks ago that the Minister of Service Nova Scotia Municipal Relations has no time for these homeowners. While they face unsafe water conditions and the possibility of having a bill of $25,000 per household. Mr. Speaker, will the Minister of Service Nova Scotia Municipal Relations tell the people of Monarch Riverdale Estates that what the member from Waverley Fall River Beaverbank has done on their behalf to secure funding for this necessary project?
The Honourable Minister of Service Nova Scotia Municipal Relations.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to start the answer of my question by saying that I did meet with some of the citizens and representatives of Monarch Rivendell, and I have never stated I do not have enough time or time for any citizen in Nova Scotia. I would like to say that I definitely understand the frustration and concern anybody that is experiencing the lack of water in their residence. And there are areas all across the province that are experiencing some of these concerns. Monarch Rivendell, I can definitely understand their frustration, but there was a project in place that did allow them to get water to a certain point. This is, and I am not pointing any fingers, but this is how government works in Nova Scotia. Water is a municipal issue. They did not put it on their list of priorities, and so therefore, when it came to the department, we did not have it as a concern. We now recognize that they do have concerns, and we have met with them, and I have very clearly stated about our fundings. I understand their frustrations, and we are already providing money to HRM. Thank you.
The honourable member for Preston on your first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, these residents are being left out in the cold by the government and their representative. And the minister also fell back on the old cliche, Mr. Speaker, that would like to help everyone if she possibly could. Well, Mr. Speaker, she can help these homeowners if she chooses to do so. The minister pointed to the PPAC funding program, but the people of Monarch Rivendell Estates aren't convinced that she explored all the funding options available. Mr. Speaker, what other partnerships options has this minister explored so these people can have safe drinking water?
The Honourable Minister of Service, Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the question. And I just would like to clarify that, unfortunately, a number of the residents of Monarch Rivendell have a misunderstanding about how monies are allocated across the province. And I know that I've received many letters about all of the different, Building Canada Fund. They do fit under a PCAP if the municipality would wish to fund it. We are exhausted in our funding at this time, but I will say that I recognize their frustration, and I will go back and I will work with the department and we will have another look. But I will tell you, I have exhausted all of the avenues, but I will definitely give my commitment to taking another look.
The Honourable Member for Preston on your final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the residents could recycle water the way the NDP recycles stories. The Monarch Rivendell subdivision wouldn't need city water. But the story here is that these residents have been ignored by both member for Waverley Fall River Beaverbank and ignored by this government. Mr. Speaker, how much longer are the people of Monarch Rivendell Estates going to have to go without safe water? When will the NDP stop ignoring their concerns? My question to the minister is, will there be funding available in 2011 for people of Monarch Rivendell Estates?
The Honourable Minister of Service, Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations.
Thank you very much, and I thank you for the question, but I also want to preface this answer in that this is a problem that we have inherited. This is not a problem that Monarch Rivendell just developed. This has been an ongoing problem, and we did put some things in place at our last session, so this is not going to happen again because there needs to be appropriate planning. However, my answer on funding for this, you would have to ask the municipality on their list because the funding goes through the municipality back and forth that way. It's not my place to work directly through Monarch Rivendell, but it would be through the municipality and what their priorities are. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Hants West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question through you is to the Minister of Community Services. As the Minister is so keenly aware, water and electricity, along with money to pay for both, are essential ingredients in life. However, as a seniors resident in Mount Uniacke, they are doing without one of these ingredients more times than they should. At one point last week, they did not have water for 14 hours. The problem has been ongoing for a very long time. The fundamental issue right now is the total lack of water available to this residence. Can the Minister explain today what officials in her department are doing to alleviate the situation in Mount Uniacke?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank the Honourable Member for his question. What I would like to do is find out more about this particular situation. Our staff are always ready and available to help out. Sometimes the situation may involve another department, so for me to be able to explain to him what we can do, I need to find some more information about it. Thank you very much.
The Honourable Member for Hants West on your first supplementary.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And originally, the water source at this residence was being blamed as the problem. So the water source was changed so that water could be drawn from Murphy Lake, situated behind the seniors' residence, but unfortunately, the water is not drinkable. It's practically impossible to believe that as we approach 2011, water cannot be supplied on a consistent basis to a government facility. Does the Minister see a solution to this difficulty?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for the question. I would say that the solution is for me to be able to, as I said before, to talk with the honourable member, gather some more information, find out where those responsibilities lie with the water supply, and to see if there's a role that community services can play in terms of helping the seniors out with the situation. Thanks.
The Honourable Member for Hants West and your final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'll put my final supplementary to the Minister of Environment. The seniors have been more than patient. They have a lake right behind their residence, as I said, but no consistent running water. Presently, they have equipment set up behind the residence which somehow has to be protected and enclosed for the winter. The last excuse these folks need to hear is, sorry, the water lines are frozen. Mr. Minister, through you, Mr. Speaker, to the Minister, is there anything your department can do expeditiously now to ensure constant flow of water for these seniors, not only now, but in the years ahead?
The Acting Minister of the Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and the member would know I would have a great interest in that facility. I'll pass this question on to Department of Environment staff to see what's possible with them. The issue around water in that facility has been ongoing for some time. I think the Department of Community Services has been assuring them of drinking water that they've been seeing that facility gets. A little surprised by the lack of water in this recent connection to Murphy Lake, but anyway, I'll pass his comments on to the Department of Environment and see if I can get some information back to him.
The Honourable Member for Kings West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians have had to put up with this government's inaction on the economy for 17 months now. Life is more expensive thanks to the NDP HST hike and the NDP electricity tax. Young people are leaving the province in order to find work. Unemployment is unacceptably high. Yet this NDP government thinks they can tax and spend their way to prosperity. My question is to the Minister of Economic and Rural Development. Why has his government abandoned economic development for higher taxes and increased government spending?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member opposite for the question. Part of that question has already been answered here today, but I'm going to elaborate a little bit, if I may, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, since we've been in government, since June, we've created or maintained over 7,400 jobs. That's through economic and rural development and NSBI, and that's in every region of this country. Mr. Speaker, I've got to also comment is that the previous government started an initiative called broadband. Now, Mr. Speaker, when we became government, the broadband initiative wasn't completed, but we're proud to say under our watch, Mr. Speaker, under our watch, that is 100% built now. Now, I think it's also important, Mr. Speaker, when we talk about the economy and we talk about taxes and we talk about all these things that are job related, we also have to consider about the Community Development Trust Fund, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, what this government has done with that money and invested in small and medium-sized business, Mr. Speaker, is unparalleled in recent years as far as government is concerned. Mr. Speaker, I could go on at great lengths. Mr. Speaker, he asked the question, I'm providing an answer, and the answer is not a short one, because I could stand up for a long time to expand on the many things that we've done.
The Honourable Member for Kings West on your first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, I'd say this government is going on wireless because they aren't plugged into Nova Scotians. Just in the last month alone, 8,600 jobs lost in the province. The unemployment rate is unacceptable at 9.8%. Full-time job losses in Nova Scotia have weighted down economic performance. While Canada has returned to its pre-recessionary employment level, Nova Scotia has dipped below. My question to the Minister of Economic Development, Mr. Speaker, will the Minister put in place a winter works program so that Nova Scotians can get back to work?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'll continue, Mr. Speaker, where I left off, because we've invested in over 23 companies. Mr. Speaker, this government, $221 million. Mr. Speaker, that's nothing to sneeze about. Mr. Speaker, we've invested in Nova Scotians in every region of this province. Mr. Speaker, for the last 20 years, there's been no movement in Nova Scotia until we became government. Mr. Speaker, the Productivity Innovation Voucher program, the number of companies that program has assisted throughout all regions of this province is unparalleled again in recent years, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we have a track record. We continue to establish a track record.
Order. The time for oral question period has expired. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, before I announce business, may I be permitted an introduction, Mr. Speaker?
Certainly.
Mr. Speaker, in the East Gallery is a friend to many in this House, and I know certainly a friend of mine, and he's the son of a former councillor from the county of Halifax. No, former member from Eastern Passage, Kevin DeVoe. Please welcome you.
Order. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the business is concluded for the government today. We will be recessing and coming back to reconvene on Monday from the hours of 7 to 10, Mr. Speaker, to allow the members to get back and represent their various ridings at the various ceremonies as it relates to Remembrance Day. I would like to say that I would hope that all Nova Scotians would take the opportunity tomorrow to attend where they can at a cenotaph in respect of the brave women and men that served us so proudly. And Mr. Speaker, I also wouldn't be remiss if everyone would be very careful getting home this week, and we realize the floods and the natural disasters that have hit this province, and clearly they'll be in our thoughts all weekend, and hopefully that everyone will return here safely on Monday. With that said, Mr. Speaker, we should now rise.
Business for Monday.
Mr. Speaker, the business will be bills for second reading, the fisheries, and Bill 83, Bill 85, Bill 87, Bill 88, and Bill 89. I wish you now rise now, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. The motion is to adjourn. All those in favour signify by saying aye. Aye. Those against say nay. The motion is carried. We are adjourned till 7 o'clock on Monday. Have a good Remembrance Day weekend.